1920 studio photograph found, and historians are impressed when they zoom in on the chair. The archive room of the Metropolitan Museum of Art smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals, a scent Emma Hartfield had grown to love over her 15 years as a photography curator. On this particular October afternoon in 2018, sunlight filtered through the high windows, illuminating dust particles that danced above the rows of archival boxes stacked on metal shelves. Emma carefully lifted another photograph from the collection donated by the Pemberton estate. The elderly collector had passed away 6 months earlier, leaving behind thousands of images spanning nearly a century. Most were predictable: family portraits, vacation snapshots, society events. But this one made her pause. The photograph showed a woman in her early 30s, seated in an ornate chair against a plain studio backdrop. The image quality was remarkable for 1920. Sharp focus, excellent composition, professional lighting. The woman wore a drop-waist dress typical of the era, her dark hair styled in finger waves. Her expression was confident, almost defiant, as she gazed directly at the camera. But it was the chair that caught Emma's attention. She pulled her desk lamp closer, studying the elaborate armrests. 2 carved dragons spiraled upward, their scales meticulously detailed, their bodies intertwining in an Art Deco style that seemed almost too sophisticated for the period. The lacquered wood gleamed even in the century-old photograph. Emma reached for her magnifying glass, examining every detail. The dragon's eyes, the curve of their tails, the geometric patterns along the chair's legs. Something about this piece felt familiar, though she couldn't immediately place it. She turned the photograph over. On the back, written in faded ink, VA, Studio Session, March 1920, New York. Just initials. No full name, no photographer's mark, no other identifying information. Emma photographed the image with her phone and opened her laptop. She spent the next hour scrolling through databases of early 20th century furniture, decorative arts catalogs, and design archives. The style was clearly Art Deco, but with an unusual refinement, more European than American. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across her desk, Emma leaned back in her chair, frustrated. She was certain she had seen this dragon motif before. But where? Then, almost by accident, her search led her to a Christie's auction catalog from 2009. She scrolled through the pages of the Yves Saint Laurent collection, and suddenly her breath caught in her throat. There it was, the exact same chair. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she enlarged the auction photograph on her screen. The fauteuil au dragon, the dragon's chair, created by Irish designer Eileen Gray between 1917 and 1919. According to the catalog description, it had sold for approximately $28 million, shattering records for 20th century decorative arts. She placed her phone beside the laptop, comparing the 1920 photograph to the auction images. Every detail matched perfectly. The sinuous dragons climbing the armrests, the lacquered finish, the proportions of the seat, even the distinctive way the dragon's tails curved beneath the arms. This was impossible, or rather, highly improbable. The auction catalog stated that Yves Saint Laurent had acquired the chair decades ago, and it had remained in his private collection until his death. The provenance traced back through several European collectors, but nowhere did it mention the piece ever being in the United States, especially not in 1920. Emma grabbed her notebook and began writing down everything she knew. Eileen Gray had created very few pieces in her early career, each one a masterwork of lacquer art and design. The dragon's chair was among her most famous creations, commissioned by a specific client. But who? She pulled up every article she could find about the chair's history, most focused on the record-breaking sale and Yves Saint Laurent's exquisite taste. A few mentioned Gray's revolutionary approach to furniture design, how she had studied lacquer techniques in London and Paris, creating pieces that bridged Eastern aesthetics and Western modernism. But the early provenance remained frustratingly vague. Private Collection Paris was the earliest notation in most sources. Emma looked again at the woman in the 1920 photograph. She sat with the poise of someone accustomed to wealth and culture, her hand resting lightly on one of the dragon armrests as if the extraordinary chair were simply part of her everyday life. Who was V.A.? And how had she come to possess one of Eileen Gray's masterpieces when Gray was still virtually unknown outside of small Parisian design circles? Emma checked her watch. Nearly 6 o'clock. The archive would close soon, but her mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow's research. She needed to find out more about this mysterious woman, about how an Irish designer's revolutionary furniture ended up in a New York photography studio in 1920. She carefully placed the original photograph in an archival sleeve and locked it in her desk drawer. Emma arrived at the museum an hour early the next morning, coffee in hand and determination in her stride. She had barely slept, her mind spinning with possibilities about the mysterious photograph. Before diving into the archives, she needed to establish a research plan. First priority, identify V.A. She started with the obvious: New York social registers from 1920. The city's elite were meticulously documented in those days, their comings and goings recorded in newspapers and society directories. If V.A. could afford an Eileen Gray chair and professional studio photography, she likely moved in wealthy circles. Emma pulled up digitized copies of the New York Social Register from 1919 and 1920. She scanned through hundreds of names, looking for women with those initials. Victoria Ashton. No, she had died in 1918. Vera Abbott. Possible, but she would have been only 19 in 1920, and the woman in the photograph appeared older. Violet Anderson, Virginia Aldrich, Vanessa Armstrong. None seemed quite right based on the limited biographical information available. Then, on page 47 of the 1920 register, she found it. Vivian Ashford, age 32. Residence, 842 Fifth Avenue. Occupation listed as patroness of the arts. Emma's pulse quickened. She cross-referenced the name in the New York Times Historical Archive. The first mention appeared in 1912. Miss Vivian Ashford, recently returned from Paris, hosted an intimate gathering at her family's Fifth Avenue residence to showcase emerging European artists. More articles followed. Vivian had been a fixture in Manhattan's art world throughout the 1910s and early 1920s. She organized exhibitions, purchased works by unknown painters and sculptors, and frequently traveled to Europe to discover new talent. The Times described her as a woman of impeccable taste and considerable influence in shaping New York's appreciation for modern art. Emma found a small photograph accompanying a 1918 article about a gallery opening. Though the image quality was poor, she could make out Vivian's distinctive features, the same elegant bone structure, the same confident bearing as the woman in the studio portrait. This had to be her. Emma continued reading. Vivian had inherited substantial wealth from her father, a shipping magnate who had died in 1910. Unmarried and independent, she had devoted herself entirely to the arts, becoming one of the few women collectors taken seriously by New York's male-dominated art establishment. But then, abruptly, the mention stopped. The last article Emma could find was from November 1929, a brief notice that Vivian Ashford had closed her Fifth Avenue residence. After that, nothing. No obituary, no further society mentions, no trace of what had happened to her or her collection. Emma spent the afternoon reaching out to colleagues who specialized in early 20th century decorative arts. She sent careful emails, attaching images of both the 1920 photograph and the auction catalog pages, asking if anyone knew of connections between American collectors and Eileen Gray's early work. While waiting for responses, she dug deeper into Vivian Ashford's travels. The New York Times archive revealed that Vivian had spent extended periods in Paris, 3 months in 1913, 6 months in 1917, another 4 months in 1919. Each trip coincided with her purchasing artwork or furniture for her collection. Emma pulled out a timeline on her notepad. Eileen Gray had created the Dragon's Chair between 1917 and 1919. Vivian was in Paris for 6 months in 1917. The timing was almost too perfect. She found a reference in a 1917 issue of American Art News. Miss Vivian Ashford writes from Paris that she has discovered several extraordinary craftspeople working in the modern style, whose pieces she believes will revolutionize interior design. Could Gray have been one of those craftspeople? Emma contacted the Eileen Gray archives in Dublin, explaining her discovery and asking about early clients. The archivist, a woman named Catherine, responded within hours. Her email was enthusiastic. Any new information about Gray's early career was precious, as the designer had been notoriously private and kept few records from that period. Catherine confirmed that Gray had indeed taken commissions from private clients between 1917 and 1920, though specific names were rarely documented. Most clients were European, wealthy individuals who appreciated Gray's unique fusion of Japanese lacquer techniques and Art Deco aesthetics. Gray had worked from a small studio in Paris, creating custom pieces that took months or even years to complete. The Dragon's Chair was one of her most ambitious early works, Catherine wrote. The lacquer alone required dozens of layers, each needing weeks to cure. It's entirely possible she created it for an American client. We simply don't have the records to confirm it. Emma leaned back in her chair, processing this information. If Vivian had commissioned the chair directly from Gray in 1917, it would have been ready by 1919 or early 1920, exactly when the photograph was taken. Vivian could have shipped it to New York, had it photographed, and displayed it in her Fifth Avenue home. But then what? How had the chair ended up back in Europe, eventually making its way to Yves Saint Laurent's collection? Emma's phone buzzed. An email from the Metropolitan's registrar, whom she had asked to check for any records of Vivian Ashford's collection. The message was brief. Check the 1932 estate sale records. You might find something interesting. The estate sale catalog from 1932 sat in the museum's rare books collection, its pages yellowed but still legible. Emma requested it immediately and carried it to a reading room, handling it with the reverence it deserved. She opened to the index, running her finger down the list of consignors. There it was. Estate of Vivian Ashford, Fifth Avenue residence. Furniture, paintings, decorative arts. Emma turned to the relevant pages. The catalog listed dozens of items: paintings by European modernists, sculptures, Chinese ceramics, Art Deco furniture pieces. Everything had been sold to settle the estate. But as she read through the descriptions, her heart sank. There was no mention of the Dragon's Chair or anything resembling it. She checked 3 times to be certain, examining every furniture listing. Chairs, tables, cabinets, even a lacquered screen, but not the Dragon's Chair. Emma pulled out her notebook and wrote, "Where did the chair go between 1920 and 1932? She returned to the New York Times archive, searching for any mention of Vivian between 1929 and 1932. Finally, she found a small article from December 1929, just weeks after the stock market crash. Miss Vivian Ashford, long a supporter of New York's artistic community, has been forced to liquidate portions of her collection due to financial reverses. Several paintings have been sold privately to European collectors." Emma's chest tightened. The Depression had devastated even wealthy families, and Vivian, despite her inheritance, hadn't been immune. If she had needed to sell her most valuable pieces quickly, she might have reached out to European dealers and collectors who still had money. Another search revealed a brief obituary from March 1931. Vivian Ashford, patroness of the arts, passed away at Roosevelt Hospital following a brief illness. She was 43 years old. Miss Ashford never married and leaves no immediate family. 43. So young. Emma sat back, piecing together Vivian's final years. The stock market crash in October 1929. Desperate sales to stay afloat, closing her Fifth Avenue home, then illness and death less than 2 years later, alone and financially ruined. But the Dragon's Chair, that was the key. If Vivian had sold it before her death, possibly as early as 1930, it could have gone to a European collector. From there, it could have passed through several hands over the decades before reaching Yves Saint Laurent. Emma needed to confirm this theory. She composed an email to Christie's auction house, explaining her research and asking if they had any provenance information beyond what was published in the 2009 catalog. Specifically, she wanted to know who owned the chair before it entered Saint Laurent's collection. As she hit send, Emma looked again at the 1920 photograph. Vivian's confident expression now seemed tinged with something else, perhaps a hint of defiance or determination. She had been a woman ahead of her time, championing modern design when most Americans still preferred traditional styles. She had recognized Eileen Gray's genius before the world did. 3 days later, Emma received a response from Christie's. The email was professional but cautious. Auction houses guarded their provenance research carefully. However, the specialist, a man named Julian, was intrigued enough by her discovery to share some information. "According to our records," he wrote, "the Dragon's chair entered Yves Saint Laurent's collection in 1973, purchased from a Parisian gallery owned by Jacques Doucet. Before that, we traced it to a private collection in Lyon, France, owned by a textile manufacturer named Henri Beaumont. Our research suggested Beaumont acquired the chair sometime in the early 1930s, though the exact date and circumstances were unclear. If your evidence shows it was in New York in 1920, this fills a significant gap in the provenance." Emma immediately researched Henri Beaumont. He had been a successful industrialist who collected Art Deco furniture and collaborated with several designers. His collection had been sold off piecemeal after his death in 1968, with various items going to galleries and private collectors throughout France. The timeline was fitting together. Vivian owned the chair in 1920. By 1930 or 1931, facing financial collapse, she likely sold it, probably through a dealer who shipped it back to Europe. Beaumont purchased it around 1932, kept it for decades, and after his death, it eventually made its way to Yves Saint Laurent. But Emma wanted more than theory. She needed proof. She contacted the New York City Municipal Archives, requesting any available records for Vivian Ashford's residence at 842 Fifth Avenue. Property records, tax documents, anything that might list the contents of the home or mention sales of valuable items. While waiting, Emma drafted an article proposal for the museum's quarterly journal. The Lost Provenance of Eileen Gray's Dragon's Chair, an American Connection. If she could definitively establish that Vivian had owned the chair, it would be a significant art historical discovery, not just for Gray's legacy, but for understanding how European modernism had been collected and appreciated in America decades earlier than most scholars believed. Her phone rang. It was Michael Chen, a colleague from the archives department. "Emma, I found something interesting in the Pemberton collection. More photographs. Same woman, same time period. You should see these." Emma rushed to the archive room. Michael had spread 6 additional photographs across the examination table, all from the same donation. Each showed Vivian Ashford in different settings, standing beside a modern painting, examining a sculpture, sitting in her Fifth Avenue drawing room. And in the background of 2 photographs, barely visible but unmistakable, was the Dragon's chair. "This is incredible," Emma whispered, leaning closer. One image showed Vivian's entire sitting room, decorated in a strikingly modern style, clean lines, minimal ornamentation, geometric patterns. The Dragon's chair occupied a prominent position near the window. "She really was ahead of her time," Michael observed. Emma knew she needed to understand not just what Vivian owned, but who she was. The photographs showed a woman of taste and vision, but Emma wanted to understand her motivations, her relationships, her connection to Eileen Gray. She spent a week searching through letters and personal papers archived at various institutions. The New York Public Library held a small collection of correspondence between Vivian and several gallery owners. The Smithsonian Archives of American Art had a few letters Vivian had written to artists she supported. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Emma had contacted the National Library of Ireland, hoping they might have records related to Irish expatriates in Paris during the 1910s. A librarian named Siobhan replied with an intriguing discovery. Several letters from Eileen Gray to her mother mentioned an American patron with exceptional understanding of modern design. The letters, written between 1917 and 1919, described a client who had commissioned the Dragon's chair. Gray wrote with unusual warmth about this person, noting that unlike most clients who simply wanted fashionable pieces, this woman genuinely understood the artistic and philosophical intentions behind the work. "She sees what I am trying to achieve," Gray wrote in September 1917. "Not merely furniture, but objects that embody a new way of living, freedom from historical pastiche, honesty in materials, beauty through function. She speaks of creating spaces that reflect modern consciousness. It is rare to find such sympathy of vision. Though Gray never mentioned the client's name directly in these letters, the timeline and details matched perfectly with Vivian's Paris sojourn. Emma found another letter from March 1918. The American commissioned The Dragon Armchair has visited the studio 3 times this month. We have long conversations about art, design, the role of women in shaping cultural progress. She tells me about New York, about bringing these ideas to America. I believe she will be successful. She has both the resources and the determination. Emma felt a thrill of recognition. This wasn't just a transaction between designer and client. This was a friendship, a meeting of minds between 2 visionary women who understood each other's aspirations. She dug further, finding references in French design journals from 1919. One article about emerging decorative artists mentioned that Eileen Gray's work had been seen in the collection of a New York patroness who divides her time between Paris and Manhattan. The pieces were falling into place. Vivian hadn't simply purchased the chair as a status symbol. She had formed a genuine connection with Gray, recognized her genius early, and actively supported her work. The Dragon's Chair represented not just artistic achievement, but a friendship that bridged continents and cultures. Emma wondered if there were more letters, perhaps in private hands. She began reaching out to descendants of people in Vivian's social circle. Emma's research into Vivian's final years proved heartbreaking. She found additional newspaper clippings that painted a picture of a woman watching her world collapse. A June 1930 article in the New York Herald Tribune mentioned that Miss Vivian Ashford has closed her Fifth Avenue residence and taken temporary lodging at the Barbizon Hotel for Women. The Barbizon, while respectable, was a dramatic step down from her former home, a place for young working women and those of modest means. Emma located the hotel's historical records at the New York Historical Society. Guest registers showed that Vivian had lived there from June 1930 until January 1931, occupying a small single room on the 8th floor. The contrast to her previous life must have been devastating. She found one more article from November 1930 in a small arts newsletter. Vivian Ashford, once among New York's most influential collectors, has sold several significant pieces from her collection to European buyers. Friends report that Miss Ashford remains dedicated to supporting artists despite her changed circumstances, having recently donated funds to help a young painter continue her studies. Even in financial ruin, Vivian had maintained her generosity. Emma discovered records from Roosevelt Hospital showing that Vivian had been admitted in February 1931 with pneumonia. She died 4 weeks later, her medical bills paid by a women's charity organization. The estate sale in 1932 had been organized not by family, Vivian had none, but by the hotel management and creditors. Everything remaining was sold to settle debts. The furniture cataloged was from her hotel room and whatever had been stored after she closed the Fifth Avenue residence. The best pieces, including the Dragon's Chair, had clearly been sold earlier. Emma found one final, deeply moving document, Vivian's last will and testament, filed with the New York County Surrogates Court. It was brief. Her remaining funds, less than $800, were left to the Women's Art Association of New York, with a note requesting they use it to support women artists working in modern styles, particularly those whose vision exceeds current fashion. Emma sat in the research library, that will in front of her, and felt the full weight of Vivian's story. Here was a woman who had lived boldly, collected brilliantly, and recognized revolutionary talent. She had befriended Eileen Gray when Gray was unknown, purchased the Dragon's Chair when others saw only strange foreign furniture, and when the Depression took everything, she had faced her losses with dignity, still thinking of others even as she died alone in a charity hospital. The Dragon's Chair had survived, becoming famous, selling for millions. But Vivian's name had been forgotten. Not anymore, Emma thought. Emma spent the next 2 months building an airtight case for her research paper. She compiled every piece of evidence, the original 1920 photograph, the additional images showing Vivian's apartment, the correspondence between Gray and her mother, the timeline of sales and acquisitions, and the documentation of Vivian's financial collapse. She contacted Catherine in Dublin again, sharing everything she had discovered. Catherine was elated. "This is exactly the kind of documentation we need," she wrote back. "Gray's early years are so poorly documented." Knowing that the Dragon's Chair was commissioned by Vivian Ashford, that it traveled to New York, and that these two women had a genuine artistic friendship, it's invaluable. Together, they worked to fill in remaining gaps. Catherine found customs records showing that a large crate had been shipped from Paris to New York in January 1920, consigned to Vivian Ashford at 842 Fifth Avenue. The contents were listed as decorative furniture, lacquered wood. Emma discovered financial records indicating that in October 1930, Vivian had received payment from a Parisian art dealer named Marcel Duval for furniture items, modern design. The amount, $4,000, was substantial, but far less than the chair's true value. Vivian had clearly been desperate. Through the Beaumont family archives in France, Emma confirmed that Henri Beaumont had purchased several Art Deco pieces from Duval's gallery in 1932, including a lacquered armchair with dragon motifs. The circle was complete. Emma drafted her article, carefully documenting each connection. She wrote about Vivian not as a footnote in the chair's history, but as a central figure, a woman whose vision and courage deserved recognition. She described the friendship between Vivian and Gray, two women who defied conventional expectations and saw beauty in radical simplicity and honest materials. She wrote about loss too, how the Depression had destroyed not just fortunes but entire worlds of culture and patronage, how Vivian's collection had been scattered, her name forgotten, her contributions erased. But most importantly, she wrote about recovery, how a single photograph, overlooked for decades, could restore a lost connection and give voice to a silenced story. The Metropolitan Museum's Publications Committee accepted the article immediately. They wanted to mount a small exhibition around it. Vivian Ashford and the Dragon's Chair, a lost chapter in American collecting. They would display the 1920 photograph alongside research materials, images of Gray's work, and contextual information about women collectors in the early 20th century. Emma contacted Christie's and the current owners of the Dragon's Chair. It had been purchased from Saint Laurent's estate by a private collector, asking permission to include images of the chair in the exhibition. To her delight, they agreed enthusiastically. The exhibition opened in September 2019, occupying a small gallery on the Metropolitan Museum's second floor. Emma had worked with the design team to create an intimate space that reflected both Vivian's aesthetic sensibility and the story's emotional arc. The centerpiece was the 1920 photograph, enlarged and beautifully lit, showing Vivian seated confidently in the Dragon's Chair. Surrounding it were the other images from the Pemberton collection, documents, letters, and a detailed timeline that traced the chair's journey from Paris to New York to Europe, and finally, to auction glory. One wall featured a large reproduction of Eileen Gray's portrait alongside excerpts from her letters, revealing the friendship between the two women. Another section documented Vivian's life, her travels, her collection, her influence on New York's art scene, and ultimately her losses during the Depression. The exhibition text, which Emma had written and rewritten dozens of times, emphasized Vivian's pioneering vision. She had been among the first Americans to recognize the significance of European modernism in design, decades before it became fashionable. She had supported women designers at a time when their work was systematically undervalued, and she had understood that furniture could be art, radical, beautiful, transformative art. Media coverage exceeded expectations. The New York Times ran a feature article with the headline, "The Woman Who Saw the Future, Rediscovering Vivian Ashford." Design magazines picked up the story, fascinated by this forgotten collector who had owned a $28 million chair when it was merely an experimental piece by an unknown Irish designer. Catherine flew from Dublin for the opening. Standing together in front of the photograph, she and Emma marveled at what they had uncovered. "You've given them both back to history," Catherine said quietly. "Vivian and Eileen, their connection, their friendship, their shared vision. That matters." Emma nodded, looking at Vivian's face in the photograph. That confident expression made perfect sense now. Vivian had known she was part of something important, that the chair beneath her represented a new way of thinking about design and living. She had been right, even if she hadn't lived to see it recognized. Visitors moved through the small gallery, reading the story, examining the photographs, connecting past and present. Many paused longest before the 1920 image, drawn to Vivian's direct gaze and the extraordinary chair she sat upon. Emma watched them, satisfied. This was why she loved her work, not just preserving old photographs, but understanding the lives they represented, the connections they revealed, the stories they held. A single image, properly examined and researched, could resurrect an entire world. The dragon's chair still belonged to a private collector, worth millions, famous throughout the design world. But now everyone who saw it would know that it had once belonged to Vivian Ashford, that it had traveled to New York in 1920, that it represented not just artistic genius, but also friendship, vision, and courage. Emma returned to her office that evening, tired but content. On her desk, she had placed a small reproduction of the 1920 photograph. Vivian looked out at her, eternally seated in the chair that had outlasted empires and scandals, and even death itself, a chair that had finally led back to the remarkable woman who had first recognized its power. The mystery was solved, the connection was restored, and Vivian Ashford's name would not be forgotten again.